Normally, I like starting off my videos with a fun little anecdote or metaphor, but today there's enough to talk about that I'm not going to bury the lead. The Book of Boba Fett appears to have been a trap for Kathleen Kennedy, which she made for herself.
Sir, had you better buckle up? Buckle this! Ludicrous speed! Go! What have I done? My brains are going into my feet!
There will be spoilers for the Book of Boba Fett moving forward, so if you haven't watched it yet, watch the show, then come back here and check this out because in this video, we're going to talk about a theory backed up by some evidence on how the Book of Boba Fett was ultimately Kathleen Kennedy's pet project, a monkey wrench tossed into the Mandoverse like a hand grenade by a cynical corporate executive wrestling for credit of the popular Mandoverse.
That's what.
We're going to discuss how this blew up in Kennedy's face with the show's apparent failures. And then we're going to finish up talking about how inserting Kathleen Kennedy's own detestable brand of Star Wars into the Mandoverse may have showcased the difference between what she does and real Star Wars, and it may have even gotten Dave Filoni promoted. As usual, once I've laid out my case, I'll want to hear from you. Do you think this was a trap of Kennedy's own making, or is there something else going on? Drop your thoughts in the comments and we'll discuss it. As for me, well, this is what I think.
It's a trap!
Oops.
Do you remember what the Star Wars fandom was like back in 2018? The stench of The Last Jedi clung to the air like an egg fart that just wouldn't go away. The backlash to this resulted in large swathes of the fandom boycotting Solo: A Star Wars Story. Of course, Solo bombed at the box office, a feat that was unthinkable for a Star Wars film. Prior to that, shills in the media claimed the film's poor box office came from Star Wars fatigue, because there was only a few months that separated the release of Last Jedi and Solo.
Okay. Yes, let it out. Have a good cry.
Of course, this was always nonsense. Not even Disney believed it. But they did, however, believe that fans were quite pissed off. So pissed that a planned Boba Fett film, which Disney had picked out a director for and everything, was being cancelled. Now, this would have been around the time that The Mandalorian Season 1 was being produced. It's no coincidence that right after the Boba Fett movie was cancelled, Fett was written into the very next Mandalorian season. This tells me that Favreau was given the green light to use this character, and it's very likely he was pushed to incorporate Fett.
Do it.
It's possible this was because Lucasfilm already had the outline of a Boba Fett story in place. Maybe it's because they simply realized how popular Boba Fett has been among Star Wars fans for decades. I think it's a little bit of both, and it's clear that for most of the chapters in the Book of Boba Fett, Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni had minimal influence. Favreau is credited with writing the show, but he hasn't been mentioned much in the news lately, and he seems fairly distant from the whole production. Very unusual compared to his high profile with The Mandalorian. But here's someone who hasn't been shy about attaching his name to this project. Robert Rodriguez, who was brought in by Kathleen Kennedy to be executive producer on the show, was the director of chapters 1, 3, and 7 of Boba Fett. As you can see by this puff piece article, Robert Rodriguez was given free rein to, quote, put his mark on the Book of Boba Fett. Well, it's no coincidence the chapters he directed were the worst rated by IMDb. Those episodes were perfect examples of Kathleen Kennedy's Star Wars.
You just don't get it, do you? You don't.
One last piece of evidence that the Book of Boba Fett was Kathleen Kennedy's baby. Do you remember the spray paint that the hoodlums painted in Chapter 1 of the show? The internet was abuzz with rumors after this happened, because that right there is the symbol for K in the Huttese alphabet, meaning the hoodlums spray painted KK on a building after destroying it. Most people took this as a symbol for Kathleen Kennedy vandalizing Star Wars. Nobody has mentioned this, but later in the show, I can't help but notice that after Boba Fett got his revenge on those biker hoodlums for killing the Tusken Raiders, it turned out that the bikers weren't guilty at all. They were framed. I think this can be fairly interpreted as Lucasfilm saying Kathleen didn't do nothing. Well, I can only think of one person who would want to convey that message.
Yo, she-bitch. Let's go.
Unfortunately for Kathleen Kennedy, there are lots of signs that the Book of Boba Fett failed. I'm going to go through each of them, and stay with me on this one because it's going to show what a colossal self-own this whole project was for Kathleen Kennedy. First off, this article from That Park Place does a nice job of explaining some of its failure. Was Han Solo cut from the Book of Boba Fett? There were many rumors from a variety of sources that all pointed towards Han Solo appearing in the last episode of the Book of Boba Fett. Yet that didn't happen. Why? In case you aren't familiar with this rumor from a few weeks ago, let me catch you up to speed. Before the finale of the Book of Boba Fett, an eagle-eyed YouTuber spotted Harrison Ford's name in the credits of Chapter 7 of the show on IMDb, accompanied by rumors that a de-aged version of Harrison Ford as Han Solo would make a brief appearance. Alright, now let's continue reading. One theory that seems to be gaining traction with my sources is that the reason Solo wasn't in the show is very simple. Apparently, as the series had just made it to Disney+, there was a point in which it may have been determined that Boba Fett wasn't getting a second season. The show's ratings were dropping after the second episode, so it could have been at that point. There's no reason to continue with a character if that character can't draw in fans, right? The article then shows a list of the Nielsen ratings for streaming shows during the week of Boba Fett's 4th episode, showing the show in 5th place right behind some show called Cheer. To put this into perspective, that's the streaming equivalent of if the Revenge of the Sith was beaten at the box office by Bring It On.
I don't care what universe you're from, that's gotta hurt.
As the theory goes, Han Solo was cut because Disney made the decision to not pursue additional seasons for the Book of Boba Fett. As a result, an appearance by Han Solo made no sense, as it would have appeared at the end and teased the next season. Thus, instead we were given 2 replacement endings that didn't add up to much of a send-off for the new Major Domo. First, we had a hokey Boba Fett and the Vespa Kids share a laugh scene. That would have been fine for ending the Vespa Kids storyline, but probably not for a bounty hunter whose story is coming to a close. Then the second clip we had was of the Mandalorian and Grogu. Imagine that. The Mandalorian and Grogu get the final scene in Boba Fett's own series. Do you think that was really the original way they wanted to end it? Rather, instead, the ending we got for Boba Fett may have been the intended opening scene for The Mandalorian Season 3. For further evidence that the Book of Boba Fett won't be getting a second paragraph, look at this interview from Boba Fett himself, Mr. Temuera Morrison.
So I'm glad to be part of that waka, that journey, and bringing the Book of Boba alive. I'll be on Te Karere next week because my book is empty at the moment, so I'm looking for a job, and after my interview with Scotty today, I'll be getting offers to be a journalist.
And if that's not enough for you, his co-star of the show recently put out this tweet, clarifying that there are no plans for a second season of the Book of Boba Fett. And here's more bad news for the show. The Rotten Tomatoes score for the show has dropped back down to 60%. A few weeks ago, it ticked back up into the lower 60s right after the Luke Skywalker and Mandalorian episodes, but now it's come back down. Here's one final bit of evidence that the show simply didn't do well. Look at this Google Trends chart, which shows how often people searched up various topics on Google. The red line represents Hawkeye, the lowest rated Marvel show on Disney+. The Book of Fett is the blue line, and as you can see, the show was simply stomped by Hawkeye.
Nobody cares.
So, after the ending of the Season 2 of The Mandalorian, it was very clear that there was a new power in the realm of Star Wars and Lucasfilm. One that was much more popular than anything Kathleen Kennedy's flunkies had ever put together. Luke Skywalker's appearance absolutely exhilarated the fans. Look at the way The Mandalorian was written. The scripts were tightly woven together, the narrative thread was clear, everything fell into place nicely and set up future shows brilliantly. But the Book of Boba Fett was the movie script equivalent of a 4-year-old's crayon picture.
Dude, I don't get it. I don't get it either.
I don't get it either. Did Jon Favreau just forget how to write for the first 4 chapters of the show? And then, did he suddenly remember again for chapters 5 and 6 before suffering a tragic brain aneurysm which caused him to produce the narrative abortion that was chapter 7? Well, that's one theory, but here's another. Kathleen Kennedy saw the success of The Mandalorian and she forced her canceled Boba Fett project onto the Mandoverse. She saw the success that Luke Skywalker brought to the franchise, and she was determined to prove that she could replicate the success using her ideas, but without Luke Skywalker. After all, this was a character that she and her acolytes at Lucasfilm had purposely sought to destroy.
Why are you the way that you are?
So, she urged Favreau to shoehorn in the story that she wanted and to undo the separation of Grogu from Din Djarin in a move that absolutely smacks of a corporation imposing its will on a creator in order to continue selling merchandise from their franchise's biggest hit. Luke was only brought in the Book of Fett to achieve that part of the narrative equation and to avoid decanonizing the sequels. After all, as I and others noted a few weeks ago, if Grogu had become Luke's first student at the Jedi Academy, then it would have retconned the sequel trilogy, since Ben Solo was Luke's first student, according to a comic book that had appeared in canon a few years previous. In order to write this part of the show, Favreau enlisted Filoni, who has a writing credit for episode 6 of the Book of Boba Fett. The show was filmed from approximately December of 2020 until June or so of 2021, and as you may remember, in May of 2021, it was announced that Dave Filoni was the executive producer and creative director at Lucasfilm moving forward. In other words, he was given creative control of Star Wars right about the time that his episode that he wrote was likely being filmed. What do you want to bet that the CEO of Disney, Bob Chapek, who has 2 eyes just like the rest of us, could clearly see the difference between Kennedy's Star Wars and true Star Wars? And his reaction when seeing what Kathleen had done was similar to ours.
You bastard!
It turns out Kathleen Kennedy, the hyper-feminist, sold the upper brass at Disney a Star Wars without a prominent Luke Skywalker, who was too much of a symbol of positive masculinity to have lying around in her stories.
What is it? What do you smell? Man flesh.
Her process, however, lacked the soul that we got in The Mandalorian, and it failed hard, so they called off Season 2 and took Solo out of the show. This is also what caused the upper management at Disney to promote Dave Filoni. It's why I believe that Kathleen Kennedy is simply a figurehead at Lucasfilm these days, with comparatively little power. In other words, the Lucasfilm Civil War may have tipped in our favor. But what do you think? What is Kathleen Kennedy's actual role at Lucasfilm these days? Is she basically a figurehead, relegated to projects like the High Republic while John and Dave fix everything else? Did the Book of Boba Fett seal her fate? Or do you believe Kennedy still runs the company with an iron fist? Drop your thoughts in the comment section down below and let's discuss it.
Stop this thing! I order you! Stop!
Thanks for watching, me hearties. If you haven't already, your captain is inviting you to subscribe to the channel and become a part of the crew. Life as a space pirate may not be glamorous, but there's always plenty of booty.